A severe lack of attention on GW's part when it comes to the first founding Legion's rules has set off my righteous fury. After having done one Legion already, I have decided to consolidate all of the Legions into one massive video. Mainly because I don't feel like padding this out into 18 separate ones, and compiling it all into one video is probably best for you, the viewers, to have the context of the previous points as we go from Legion to Legion, as well as best for my own sanity. If you've seen my previous White Scars video, you will know what to expect. For those who haven't, it can be simply summarized as, there are cases of odd rules, mechanics, and choices afflicting several factions in the game, but none are as objectively illogical and numerous as those which apply to several of the first founding legions. This is most likely due to the fact that those were the first codices to be released, and GW doesn't want to update those books. Oh, wait, they did. They did exactly that for the Chaos Space Marines, and added some new stuff, but they didn't change the glaring fundamental issues I will discuss in this video. My point is that many of these factions don't need more models or special detachments to make them valid. They need their foundations to be reframed so they can sit amongst the newer factions as equals. Please keep in mind that while sometimes my passion gets the better of me, I acknowledge that 8th edition is probably the best 40k has been, and everything I say with all the love of a frustrated parent. First, I'm going to go over what I call the primer of this video, and then I can begin going through each of the legions, where I will explain any objective issues that exist within the mechanics, and for which I will offer a solution, one that I intend to be tasteful. Suffice to say, this is going to be my longest video yet. It will be part faction review, part critique, and part game mod and rules suggestion. So grab yourself some models, your hobby supplies, a beverage of your choice, and let's dive in. As discussed in my previous video, this is my attempt at fixing the legions, as the greater majority of them have mechanical problems or inefficiencies that are in my opinion egregious and need to be brought to light. But before we get into looking at each legion individually, we need to look at the Astartes as a whole, because there are some odd problems on the general level as well. Astartes trait application. This is blatantly obvious, but I'm including it because if I don't, there'll probably be comments that ask me why I didn't. Reflecting on that, I can't honestly wrap my head around why this decision was made. It must have been an error or miscommunication, or GW just decided after the first 4 codices were released, more models should benefit from tactics. It's quite absurd that this hasn't been addressed. Let's acknowledge the ramifications. Not only does it send negative reinforcement to your player base, but it actively discourages the use of about half the units of those model lines, which thusly causes less army variety, and in turn less factions are able to maximize their faction traits, as you guys will see. Here is my solution. It is not uncommon across the many army factions to have their sub-faction traits restricted from certain units. Usually this is on logical, narratively driven choices, such as the Astra Militarum's Militarum Auxilia, or the Orcs Gretchen units. The Adeptus and Heretic Astartes should be no different. Here is what I am advocating for. For the Loyalists, if your army is battle-forged, all units gain the chapter tactic, with the exclusion of Servitors, due to not being Astartes. For the Heretics, if your army is battle-forged, all units gain the Legion trait, with the exclusion of Chaos Cultists, due to not being Astartes. This change now shifts the way sub-faction traits are applied to the Space Marines and Chaos Space Marine units, in line with the rest of the armies out there. It's bizarre to say, but actually makes things fair and better balanced. And it makes the Space Marine player base feel as if they aren't getting shafted. Astartes physicality. This is something that I'm surprised nobody is talking about. Why is a Space Marine, a superhuman soldier in powered armor, as fast as a guardsman? I can't be the only one who feels that it's odd that our superhuman soldiers have the same movement characteristic as the standard guardsmen. This is also true for the Adeptus Custodes, which is even more absurd. Here is what I'm advocating for. Rather than complicating things with additional abilities, I thought it best to simply increase the movement characteristic of Astartes infantry by 1 inch. I find this to be rather impactful. Yes, you can now move 1 inch further, but this also effectively makes your charges easier too, at least the ones you don't make from deep strike. Now this is something you won't necessarily feel during play, but being an inch closer to the target which you're going to charge will make a difference. To the Eldari players out there, I will acknowledge that this does bring the standard Space Marine base speed in line with that of Eldari infantry, and you might be upset by this. But keep in mind, the Eldari still remain far more agile through abilities and stratagems like Battle Focus, Matchless Agility, Fire and Fade, Eager to Flay, and Lightning Fast reactions. General Advocacy. This doesn't exactly pertain to Astartes, but I did want to throw it out there. GW. Why has nothing happened about soup? Why is there no equivalent exchange? Why is it that in your gaming system, it is objectively better to take 3 different detachments from 3 different codexes when you said yourself at the launch of 8th edition that we would be rewarded for playing thematic armies? You have had 3 FAQs at this point, and 2 releases of Chapter Approved to address this issue. Make the game fair for the players. I'm desperate to believe that this is a result of ignorance, and I'm hoping it's not short-sighted corporate greed at the expense of the existing player base. My solution? I honestly thought that specialist attachments were going to be that reward, that if your whole army was Ultramarines, you would gain access to the Victrix Guards, Stratagems, Relics, and Warlord traits. But given the form that specialist attachments ended up taking, they serve a different mechanical purpose, and that is fine. But the problem remains. So if you must maintain allies as part of matched play, which inherently makes it harder to balance, there needs to be some benefit given for keeping your army pure. A benefit that, ideally, should be comparable to the potential gained from taking allies. I actually believe that in the strictest, most competitive settings, you probably shouldn't have allies. Or if you do, you should probably only allow the Warlord's Codex to provide stratagems, relics, and Warlord traits. Alright, that's my ranting of soup done. I swear I won't talk about soup anymore this video. Okay, now with that out of the way, let's begin. Here's my golden rule when it comes to the assessment of sub-factions. If you throw fluff out the window, factions still need to have fun, unique, and valid mechanics available to them. If you fail to meet this criteria, you have factions which are immediately passed on. They are not part of the conversation. I will acknowledge no matter how many rules and units are adjusted, there will never be a perfect balance in a game as vast and complex as 40k. In other words, given any selection of factions and toolkits, there will always be a best and worst overall. But no game designer worth their salt should in good conscience leave factions in such a relatively poor state, to such a degree that nearly no argument can be made for taking them. So let's go through them, legion by legion, starting with the Ultramarines. Who better to start with than the poster boys of 40k? Now, contrary to my spiel, the Ultramarines really need no help as they are one of the better off legions with regards to rules support. But to that end, they do provide a good comparative starting point. Their chapter tactic, in my opinion, is fantastic. Thematically, it speaks to their organized and strategic methods of warfare, offering a leadership buff and enabling units to fall back and shoot with a -1 to hit penalty. And while it isn't something you can actively maximize, it does prevent them from being tied up, allowing veteran players to execute aggressive plays without fear, and providing newcomers a nice safety net. Keep in mind that should their Legion trait apply to their armored units and vehicles, as I suggested, those vehicles will be threats that must be dealt with directly, as enemy players can't just simply engage them in combat as a method of shutting them down. So while they do not have an exclusive codex of their own, they do have a vast array of units available to them, and they are supported by a large cast of supporting named characters, such as Marnius Calgar, Tigurius, and Sergeant Cronus, to name a few. In addition, they have access to multiple specialist attachments provided in Vigilus Defiant, and oh yeah, they have their Primarch, who is an undeniable powerhouse in his own right, but is also probably the best force multiplier in the game. The Ultramarines are just fine. The Imperial Fists. Here's what the Imperial Fists are supposed to offer, based on their faction focus. The Imperial Fists are masters of the close-range firefight, making maximum use of bolt weaponry. Before I begin to make my case for the Imperial Fists, I will acknowledge that their toolkit does allow them to make great use of bolt weaponry, their stratagem, Bolter Discipline. It has a great synergy with high-volume units such as Aggressors and Centurion Devastators, as well as benefiting from their specialist attachment in the Siegebreaker cohort. My issue lies with their trait. The trait as it stands is comprised of 2 perks. The first removes the bonus provided by cover to enemy units. This perk, while nice, is somewhat situational, as targets aren't always in cover, but some factions and units do have perks to always claim the benefit of cover, and against them, this becomes far more useful. Also, potentially denying the prepared position stratagem does add further value. Regarding the second perk of their trait, well, the ability to reroll filled wounds is inherently powerful, but the failing here is that buildings are so barely present in standard games that this perk can outright be ignored in anything but tailored narrative scenarios. It is these kinds of choices when creating sub-faction traits that tilt players into choosing other sub-factions. An ability this niche, as flavorful as it is, should be relegated to a bonus stratagem or specialist attachment. To address this problem, and provide the Imperial Fist with a trait that is better reflective of their ability to fortify and defend like no other, we can replace the reroll failed wound rolls against buildings with the following. Enemy units must subtract 1 from charge rolls if they suffered any wounds from Overwatch made by a unit with this ability. I believe this alteration checks all the boxes. Most importantly, it's actually useful since it's not exclusive to building units. It speaks to the fluff of the 7th Legion as defenders, and it lends itself to objective-oriented play. Overall, the Imperial Fist toolkit is pretty good. Their only real issue is the second perk of their trait. As I mentioned earlier, the Siegebreaker cohort from Vigilus Defiant is rather potent as a specialist attachment, and offers some powerful options for the Imperial Fists. And should all their vehicles be able to benefit from their trait, they really begin to feel like full-fledged siege masters. The Black Templars. Based on their faction focus, here's the goal the rules are supposed to represent. Are zealous crusaders famed for their fighting spirit and expertise in melee combat. The trait as it stands doesn't really speak to that. Simply re-rolling a failed charge does however help units get into combat, and definitely feels like an apt representation of righteous zealotry. But it hasn't aged well. In fact, it began to show its age only a few codices into 8th edition. The problem of it should be pretty clear. Not only is this an extremely simple faction rule, but we have flat out seen better implementations of this mechanic in a more recent codex, that being the Orcs. The Templars ought to be one of the best melee-oriented Astartes factions, able to contend with the Blood Angels, Space Wolves, and the World Eaters. But currently they don't. This trait isn't nearly as impactful as what those factions have at their disposal, and is a perfect example of lackluster abilities which were written at the start of 8th edition, before the impact of subfaction rules were wholly understood. To rectify this failing, I have advocated for 2 alterations. Firstly, the base quality of the trait should be improved to be consistent with the demands of 8th edition, bringing it in line with the newer iterations of this rule. And secondly, to honor this legendary chapter and speak to the heroic quality of the Templars, characters with this trait can make 1 additional attack for each wound lost to a maximum of 3. Again, while situational, it will add a nice thematic layer to the army. Black Templars heroes will fight harder in the face of death. The improvement of the charge roll will be absolutely appreciated. The ability for characters to gain a potential 3 extra attacks is huge, but it is not a consistent value add. Should a melee beatstick get the jump on your character, a Demon Prince for instance, the dice say that most characters will be outright slain, but as we know with dice, there will be times where they won't be. It also synergizes well with the stratagem, only in death does duty end, which makes good thematic sense. Also worth considering is that the Black Templars are not gaining a whole lot should their vehicles gain their chapter tactic. With that in mind, I feel just fine with them having this extra perk. Yes, as I mentioned, the back half of Codex Space Marines is pretty lackluster, but thankfully the Black Templars can access the Black Templar Sword Brethren Specialist Attachment from Vigilus Defiant, which offers up a few more tricks. That combined with the changes presented here, and the existing named characters such as Halbert and the Emperor's Champion, the Black Templars can serve as a valid combat-oriented subfaction for the Loyalist Space Marines. Next, we have the Crimson Fists. In the 2019 January issue of White Dwarf, GW released a chapter tactic and small suite of stratagems, warlord traits, and an additional relic for the Crimson Fists. In all things considered, there are some fun and fluffy tools available to them, and they are not in a bad place because of it. Their trait, Against All Odds, adds 1 to hit rolls when targeting a unit which they are outnumbered by. This for me is fantastic. Not only is it mechanically suited to their theme, but it's also refreshing compared to most subfaction rules. It provides a unique lens to frame your tactics through and incentivizes different unit choices and configurations for the faction. Which is great, and in my opinion, a strong example of good rules writing. The only adjustment I see required for the trait that we should adjust dreadnoughts to vehicles, as they would require at least the same ratio should vehicles gain access to the Crimson Fist subfaction trait. Though a little lacking in information, the faction focus for the White Scars highlights their unparalleled speed, which for me is the goal of their trait and is effectively their unique selling point. The White Scars chapter trait, as it stands officially, is a great example of the early Codex subfaction trait, which doesn't really understand how the game functions and in turn ends up being ineffective or lackluster. Allow me to explain. We can break down their trait Lightning Assault into 2 parts. The first perk is the one where the issue lies. It provides White Scars units a bonus 2 inches of movement when making their advance activations. To understand why this isn't exactly beneficial, and fails to provide the White Scars with their unparalleled speed, you need to frame what advancing is with context to the core rules. So, a note on advancing. Based on the core rules, when a unit advances, it is trading the ability to charge and shoot with all weapons, with the exception of the assault type, which can fire at a -1 to hit penalty, for the chance of moving plus 1d6 inches. Based on this exchange, unless a unit wields auto-hitting assault weapons, or has special abilities to mitigate the penalty, advancing is effectively an unreliable tool used in desperation to gain more ground, at the cost of activations in the subsequent phases. So effectively, the trait for our fast loyalist sub-faction forces White Scars units to give up their ability to shoot with their primary weapons of choice, and the ability to charge in exchange for being faster. Sure, they have a single stratagem that will allow a unit to advance and still shoot as normal plus charge, but that is only on 1 unit per turn, and nobody wants to play a sub-faction that can only maximize their trait, their unique feature that makes them stand out amongst their peers, on 1 unit per turn. Now consider how the more recent Orc sub-faction, Evil Sons, who also focus on speed with bikes and vehicles, had their rules handled, granting them more speed without losing their ability to make activations across their army. In fact, their sub-faction trait ensures they maintain their efficiency when they do advance. This comparison really frames how lackluster Lightning Assault is, and we can see why the White Scars aren't even chosen for lists that want to maximize bikers. Think about it. Why would you choose this sub-faction rule if you could just decide to play Ultramarines, granting a sub-faction trait that better serves well with bikers, along with all the other perks of playing Ultramarines? The secondary part of their trait is functionally fine as an additional perk, but it isn't substantial enough to make up for the failings of the first perk with regards to making the White Scars the Fast Legion. To solve the issue with Lightning Assault, I've advocated for the following change. Rather than grant speed at the cost of shooting and charging activations, we can actually make them faster, simply adding 1 to the move characteristic if a model has this trait, and adding 2 if they are a biker. This not only brings the representation of the White Scars' speed in line with the logical and admittedly powerful demonstrations by sub-factions such as the Evil Sons, Cabal of the Flayed Skull, and High Fleet Kraken, but also keeps them distinct from them as well, and doesn't invalidate any existing stratagems. While this is in my opinion a very logical translation of their existing rule, it is probably the sub-faction that this mod changes the most, taking the White Scars from a faction that was largely passed on, to a faction which I believe becomes rather potent. There is a trend with other high mobility armies, and that trend is that they are often competitively powerful, thinking of Evil Sons and High Fleet Kraken in particular. With this change, White Scars armies will be able to have Marines hold rear objectives, providing fire support, while squads of bikers use their speed to claim board control, leveraging bolter discipline. As I've stated before, the back half of Codex Space Marines is pretty lackluster, and thusly the suite of tools for the White Scars is just okay. I feel the change to their trait presented here elevate them so radically that it brings them into the conversation as the fastest of the chapters. The Salamanders. In the interest of transparency, the Salamanders are actually my first Space Marine army from my early days in the hobby. Suffice to say, they have a soft spot in my heart. With that said, I am confident in saying as far as Space Marine chapter tactics are concerned, I'd rate the Salamanders quite highly. Their trait is unique, fluffy, it encourages different units and war gear options, and it's actually quite potent. Against an army with few invulnerable saves, the Salamanders can punch through that armor with ridiculous reliability. So yes, the Salamander's trait is actually one of the stronger options in Codex Space Marines. But the issue I take with it, as highlighted in the quote, is that it does nothing for flame or melta-based weapons, and using that as a selling point for the faction does strike a nerve. This issue is not a problem as far as crunch is concerned, but it is a thematic low point for the toolkit, and it is what I will be addressing here. Looking at the mechanics of their trait, their ability to reroll 1 failed hit and 1 failed wound greatly benefits low volume, high impact, and high damage weapons. Think glass cannons. But their trait and toolkit as a whole fails to effectively incentivize the use of fire-based weapons at all. For starters, flame weapons auto-hit, and thereby don't benefit as effectively from their trait. Sure, they do get to reroll 1 failed wound, but let's apply context to the tool. With regards to their role in the world, they are an anti-infantry tool, and on the tabletop their stat line reflects that. But there are two major negatives which often discourage players from utilizing them, which could have been encouraged for salamanders by a well-implemented chapter tactic. Those issues are their range, which is a fair trade when you consider that flamer-type weapons auto-hit, and their inconsistent volume of fire, which is brutal when you consider it a tool that is used to deal with high volumes of infantry. But wait, friends, it gets worse. I have recently had further ruminations on the implementation of flamers. Let's consider for a moment what flamers are offering compared to a bolt gun. So, opting for the flamer, you pay more points for a weapon with worse range, an undeniable limiting factor for ranged weaponry, with an inconsistent but most likely more volume than the bolt gun. That auto-hits with the bolt gun profile, and that is the core of the problem. For Astartes, auto-hitting isn't that great of a perk. Firstly, you already have above average ballistic skill. Secondly, you already have several ways within your faction to get rerolls to hit. Even more so when you are a Master Artisan Salamander, and with the inclusion of Bolter Discipline, you have better access to the volume of the bolt gun, which again is free. What I've discovered is, for Space Marines, flamers are poor. GW needs to buff them if they want to see them used. My suggestion would be to do what they did for shotguns and rebrand the weapon calling it an Astartes Flamer, and improve some aspect of the weapon profile. And I know GW probably wants to make a specialist attachment that will make flamers and meltas viable for salamanders, but I shouldn't need to be paying a CP to unlock the option to pay more CP to address these fundamental issues. Talking specifics, Codex Space Marines tries to provide the salamander tools for fire-based weaponry through two options. The first being the Flamecraft Stratagem. While adding 1 to wound rolls always seems huge, it isn't nearly as impactful when it is limited to flamers, and the stratagem itself doesn't address the unreliability flamers are prone to. It essentially becomes unwise to even take them, and makes the Flamecraft Stratagem borderline gambling, as you pray that for all you have invested, the flamers roll at least adequately. The other major tool for maximizing fire weapon potential is Vulcan Hastan, who provides a Gilliman-like reroll aura to flamer and melta weapons, which on paper is pretty outstanding, but in practice, it somewhat stumbles over itself. Firstly, again, flamers auto-hit, and secondly, salamanders can innately do this on any weapon type, once per unit, which encourages a multiple small unit format that peppers in 1 to 2 specialty weapons per unit. The result is that Hastan is ideally used with a squad of fully decked out flamer or melta weapons. But there isn't really a valid combo here that, as I said, isn't clumsy. He is not allowed to embark in a repulsor to escort aggressors. Multi-melta Devastators don't have the range to function as artillery, and they can't efficiently use transport either since they are heavy weapons. And I think the most effective bomb, as it were, would be Assault Centurions in a Stormrave, but that is going to be a giant bullet magnet. I honestly think Hastan's buff would better complement the toolkit if it actually helped the salamanders overcome the inherent cons of using flamers and meltaguns. Both of those weapons, as cool as they are, have either cheaper alternatives or alternatives which are slightly more expensive, but absolutely worth their cost. Look, I could go on, but the short of it is, I've played countless games trying to make a flamer/melta oriented salamanders list work, and ironically, I've been burned because of it. And when I switched the meltas to las cannons and the aggressors to bolt storms, my win ratio did a complete 180. So, to somewhat remedy this issue, I would simply advocate for an additional ability, one that provides salamanders units of flame weapons a single die reroll when rolling the number of shots. Now this solves the inbuilt narrative issues with regards to their Master Artisans flamers having poor reliability, and it helps the issue with using the Flamecraft Stratagem on single model units. This change honestly isn't that much of a value add, as I've pointed out the issue with flame/melta weapons are systematic, so this change pretty much keeps salamanders where they were with regards to their competitive performance. The Master Artisan's trait is pretty rock solid when it comes to the level of strength that salamanders bring to the table, able to overcome an otherwise mediocre set of exclusive offerings found in Codex Space Marines. So I will close on my favorite chapter with the following. Considering the fact that the Salamander's toolkit, in combination with the Forge Father himself, still can't make a justifiable case for taking flamers and meltas over bolt guns and las cannons, is all the evidence I need to see that there is an underlying thematic and mechanical issue with that aspect of their toolkit. Onto the Iron Hands. The Iron Hands probably represent the second worst subfaction trait available to the Adeptus Astartes, and while a 6-up to ignore wounds isn't necessarily the worst thing possible, they have so little going on beyond that. They have 0 force multiplying named characters. Oh wait, they have one on the way. Time will tell what kind of impact he will bring. Their exclusive stratagem is honestly a tool that would have been better served to all the chapters from a game mechanics perspective. Their relic is a decent axe, and their warlord trait is Debt to the False Emperor. And to top it off, early FAQs quickly prevented units from stacking multiple rules to ignore wounds, which was probably the only thing the 10th Legion had going for them. The trait as it stands offers the Iron Hands a simple non-stackable single-featured trait. You could compare this trait to that of Craftworld Ulthwé, as they are effectively identical. However, not only does Codex Craftworlds have a far superior toolkit when compared to Codex Space Marines, but Ulthwé's Foresight of the Damned benefits all of their units, including vehicles, which in the case of the Iron Hands, who are supposed to utilize tanks to a superior degree, only further serves to place them in the bottom tier. To solve this issue with their trait, I've advocated for the following rules addition. If a model already has a similar ability, they can instead add one to the roll. While I respect the choice of not wanting players to attempt taking multiple tests to ignore damage, it results in discouraging the Iron Hands from taking units with similar abilities. You are still paying points for an ability a unit has, which you do not get to gain any value from. And thematically, if your whole deal is that you're tougher than the other guys, it's rather lame certain units, which are known for being tough, aren't. This change is undoubtedly a positive one. It would mean that Venerable Dreadnoughts and Relic Contemptors would effectively have a 5-up to ignore wounds, making them nearly as resilient as Death Guard Demon engines. And should their vehicles begin to benefit from their chapter tactic, Iron Hands players actually have incentive to make heavy use of tanks as well. I actually had 2 additional bits for the Iron Hands, both being stratagems. The first, and I kid you not, was an Iron Father upgrade for a Tech Marine. But seeing as how GW is making an Iron Hands named character, who is an Iron Father, praise be to Ferris, I will just add this as a more conventional stratagem, titled to the Admech's Machine Spirit Resurgent. In order to effectively make use of tanks as they are known to do, the Iron Hands should have a stratagem that allows them to use the top row of a model's profile for 1 CP. This probably should have been their exclusive stratagem from the get-go, but what can you do? The second stratagem, and one I am really quite fond of, Gravitic Flux Override. It essentially buffs the unit's grav weapons to D3+1 damage and grants them a reroll for their wound rolls. There are several reasons for my advocacy of this stratagem. 1. It encourages different war gear choices, creating unique and viable options for the Iron Hands. 2. It makes good narrative sense, seeing as the Iron Hands have a strong relationship with the Tech Priests of Mars. And 3. Most importantly, there is no incentive in the game for taking grav weapons anywhere. No army, no subfaction has anything to encourage the use of them. How did GW allow an entire range of weapon types to all fall to the wayside? Yes, I make the case for the Salamanders' Flame and Melta weapons rules being insufficient, but at least with them they tried. This is an absolute travesty, so I ask, why not allow these awesome weapons to at least be encouraged and enhanced to an isolated subfaction? And no other chapter is more thematically suited for it, and in dire need of a nice punch-up than the Iron Hands. Now I know I've advocated for a lot of alterations for this Legion, but let's keep in mind the fact that the Iron Hands as a faction have rather lackluster exclusives when it comes to stratagems, relics, and warlord traits, with few army-wide special rules. And with these changes, they are now far more interesting and are actually valid as a faction and can be part of the conversation. Next up, we have the Raven Guard. This one is a little tough. Based on the faction focus, we can gather the Raven Guard use speed and stealth to approach their targets to go in for the kill. The trait by design does speak to their stealth ability, offering a -1 to hit, but I really get the feeling that this early into 8th edition, the rules team didn't understand how mechanically powerful this perk is, and subsequently, players would opt to forego combat altogether and play the Raven Guard and all the sub-factions with a similar trait as a dedicated ranged gunline army, despite what the flavor text would imply the army's playstyle to be. The reason why I claim this to be tough is because, similar to the Salamanders, it's a hard sell to advocate changes to a faction that would nerf them, even if the proposed tactic would potentially better speak to the faction fluff or combat doctrines. But I'm gonna do it anyways, because I don't like the trait. I'm not a fan of creating options in game systems that are both mechanically superior to every other option and are also easier to utilize. So if it were up to me, their entire toolkit would be reframed as such. Your opponent must subtract 1 from any hit rolls when shooting at Raven Guard units with this tactic. However, a unit with this tactic loses this ability when it makes an activation in its shooting phase if any of the following apply. If any enemy units which were fired upon by this unit are not slain by the end of the turn, and all enemy units within 6 inches of the targeted enemy unit, which can also draw line of sight to the firing model, are not slain by the end of the turn. The other qualifier being, a unit with this tactic loses this ability when it makes an activation in the fight phase, if any of the following apply. If any enemy units this unit came within 1 inch of during the fight phase are not slain by the end of the turn, and all enemy units within 6 inches of the targeted unit, which can also draw line of sight to the combat, are not slain by the end of the turn. And lastly, at the start of your turn, all Raven Guard units regain this ability if all of the following apply. There are no enemy units within 12 inches, and vehicle units that suffered any wounds in the previous turn with a damage profile must roll a d6 and make the required result. Obviously the numbers of this require rigorous playtest to be ironed out. But the major shift here is that with this style of alteration, we are now changing how this very powerful perk is gated. A modification of this nature makes the Raven Guard a more cerebral style army to play, requiring players to carefully pick their targets and plot their strategy, if they want to keep the -1 to hit perk. It also provides enemy players with interesting decisions. The choices to deploy densely and move at a slower pace may deny the Raven Guard in regaining their -1 to hit perk. And based on this proposed toolkit, I would also include a Return to the Shadows style stratagem, which would enable units a limited but easier way to regain its -1 to hit perk. I am of the philosophy that you want powerful traits like an army-wide -1 to hit to require a relatively high skill floor, but also yield a higher skill ceiling. On to the Blood Angels. The Blood Angels are the first faction we're covering with their own codex. I will cut to the chase. I rate the Blood Angels rather highly. They are a combat specialized chapter, and despite combat effectively being hard mode, they have the tools to make it work. Their trait, the Red Thirst, allows units to add 1 to wound rolls in the first round of combat. An undeniably powerful trait, effectively allowing any unit to fight above their weight class. They have a great suite of stratagems, some of which allow you to redeploy 9 inches away from enemies, and even a highly coveted stratagem to charge with 3 dice instead of 2. Having their own codex grants them a host of pretty powerful unique units, a unique psychic discipline, which allows their librarians to become absolute weapons, some handy relics, one which allows CP to be regained, and another being a jump pack which ignores Overwatch and grants a reroll of failed charges, to name a few, and some very potent named characters as well. The Sons of Sanguinius are just fine with regards to rule support. Space Wolves. Similar to the Blood Angels, I am of the opinion the Space Wolves have a pretty great toolkit. They are also a melee-centric chapter with a similar suite of tools with regards to their quality, although I would rank them as a slightly more challenging faction to utilize as they require a bit more finesse. Their trait, Hunters Unleashed, grants them an ability to add 1 to charge rolls in the first round of combat. This effectively increases your hit ratio by 16%, which is a great value add, and it's very impactful when using powerful unwieldy weapons like Thunderhammers. The second perk of their trait allows their characters to double their heroic intervention range, hence my mention of increased difficulty and finesse. They have some great stratagems, some of which enhance their shooting abilities, such as the Wolf's Eye or Keen Senses, and some which are highly thematic, like Lone Wolf, which while situational, can be rather potent if the right plays are made. Their warlord traits, or rather sagas, have built-in quests, which when achieved, turn their warlord's ability into an aura. And, as you would imagine, they have their own psychic discipline, unique units, and powerful named characters. As you would expect, and being one of the newer codices to be released, the Emperor's Executioners are just fine with regards to rule support. the Dark Angels. And here we have the faction with the worst sub-faction trait available to the Adeptus Astartes. Full disclosure, I could talk quite a bit about this, as I was planning on doing a video wholly dedicated to what's going on here, but I will do my best to condense that information and keep it brief. The trait as it stands can be broken down into 2 perks. The first is, you can reroll all hit rolls of 1 for a unit when it shoots, so long as it didn't move. So this perk, which is readily available from a nearby captain, a perk that is available for 1 CP from a nearby dreadnought, a perk that is invalidated in the presence of Azrael, Samael, or Belial, a perk that only affects your infantry, dreadnoughts, and bikers, can also be obtained if you don't move. That's what we have. Who decided this was of value? Sure, this perk is identically available to subfactions like Cadia or High Fleet Kronos, but to them it's far more valuable, not only because their subfaction rules extend to their vehicles and monsters, which in this case include their standout artillery platforms and weapon beasts, but also because those same units also have rules that encourage remaining stationary, being they can fire twice or fire without needing line of sight. So this sounds about as useful as a celery sandwich. But maybe the second perk of their trait makes up the difference. Well, the second perk of their trait is you can never lose more than 1 model to morale. So no it does not. This is just more lackluster illogical rules writing which sets off my righteous fury. Space Marines as a faction already have high leadership, and they already have a built-in mechanic to reroll failed morale tests. What breaks the stupid scale completely is that neither of the Dark Angels' unique model lines are able to make use of this trait. Because obviously bikes want to be moving and Terminators are either disembarking or deep striking. But that is besides the point, as those units actively have rules that outright encourage not playing to this absurd chapter tactic. As bikes need to advance in order to use Jink, or outright invalidates the tactic as Inner Circle causes units to autopass morale. Who wrote this, and more importantly, who looked at it and said it was good enough for your players to use for an entire edition and commit it to print? If you made a successor chapter and had free reign to pick any chapter tactic you desired, this one wouldn't even make it to the table. You would rather have anything else. The Dark Angels may as well be an index army as far as chapter tactics are concerned. How is it that the First Legion, Sons of the Lion, a chapter with their own codex and range of unique models, has a worse chapter tactic than all of the Shattered Legions? Emperor be damned, this is painful. I swear, the Lion better wake up soon so he can correct the nonsense presented here. When it comes to alterations, really I think the whole codex should be rewritten. Most importantly, there are problems with the trait, and it providing adequate support to the wings that make up the Dark Angels. You see, unlike the Blood Angels or the Space Wolves, whose unique model ranges actually fit in line with their existing combat doctrines, the same can't be said for the Dark Angels Ravenwing and Deathwing, given that they're made of fast units like bikes and Terminators respectively. The Dark Angels require a solution similar to the Drukhari Codex, where the Cabal, Cults, and Covens have their own subfaction traits. But as I mentioned at the top of this section, that could be an entire video on its own. So for the sake of making the Dark Angels trait worthwhile, I will opt for a simpler solution. Firstly, should their trait extend to their vehicles, it'll begin to gain some value when applied to a weapon platform like a Predator, since you wouldn't need to leave a captain behind to babysit it to provide it the reroll hit rolls of 1 aura. But this is still a perk so readily available to any Space Marine faction, so I maintain the trait needs to be adjusted. Simply, I would advocate that we make the Dark Angels reroll hit rolls of 1 aura if they moved less than half of their total instead of not moving at all. This at least provides some support for the Deathwing as well. And we can keep the existing morale-related perk. Despite what my rant would lead you to believe, the Dark Angels actually perform well in competitive scenarios. This is largely the result of fielding admittedly powerful Ravenwing units, which provide strong synergy with each other, combining them with rather potent stratagems and ignoring the chapter tactic entirely. I am both disgusted and impressed. And I think at this point, I've spoken enough about the most loyal among the chapters. And we're going to start with none other than the Black Legion. The Black Legion hold a special place amongst the Heretic Astartes. They serve as the dark mirror to the Ultramarines. They are well organized and led by an equally charismatic figure in Abaddon. Based on their faction focus, we are told they are disciplined, maneuverable, and versatile. Looking at the trait as it stands, it seems GW noticed the thematic reflection between these legions, and saw fit to give them both the perk of increased leadership, a choice I take no issues with. Before we can review the second part of this trait, we must first break down what it really means. Keeping in mind what advancing is with regards to the core rules, the secondary perk of their trait is that Black Legion can always fire their rapid-fire weapons while advancing, with the -1 to hit penalty, with the rapid-fire profile being swapped to assault. And herein lies the issue. You still don't have a valid incentive to advance, since you are still going to shoot at a penalty, you are advancing at an unreliable pace, you are giving up your ability to charge, and you are losing the volume of rapid fire. When looking at the Black Legion, I really get the feeling GW intentionally mirrored several aspects of the Ultramarines with regards to their trait, as they both have a leadership buff, but where the Ultramarines can fall back and fire at a -1 to hit penalty, the Black Legion can advance and fire rapid-fire weapons at a -1 to hit penalty. But these perks are not equivalent. As mentioned, the Black Legion has to actively trade effectiveness to make use of their trait, that being the -1 to hit and losing the volume of rapid fire, whereas the Ultramarines trait is reactive. It is intended to allow a shooty unit to get out of what would be normally a game-altering play. To solve this problem, I've advocated for the following. Rather than simply mimicking other factions which have this rule and ignore the penalty, the Black Legion will keep the penalty to their hit rolls, which isn't too bad since they already have Ballistic Skill 3 to start, will instead be able to maintain the volume of their firepower, allowing them to advance into what would be rapid fire range and still keep that volume. I know this alteration doesn't jump out at you as being immediately strong or impactful, but we all know the basic mechanics, that anything can wound anything, which is why 8th edition favors volume, and in my opinion, this brings their trait to parity. Having a trait that doesn't require specializing in a single area, and uniquely grants them the ability to maintain the volume of their rapid-fire weapons when advancing. This especially complements the units which always benefit from Bolter discipline, such as Terminators, Bikers, and Hellbrutes, as they can advance, and even if they are at the absolute limit of their range, they would benefit from being able to shoot at full volume. Further still, Bikers would benefit to an even greater degree, as they have rules to always advance 6 inches. This would effectively give a 3-man squad of Bikers a 20-inch advance activation, and leave them with 12 bolt gun shots at a 24-inch threat range. In conclusion, the suite of stratagems available in Codex Chaos Space Marines is actually quite strong. And since the Black Legion have received an expanded set of stratagems, relics, and warlord traits, and are led by Abaddon the Despoiler himself, as well as a host of available specialist attachments from Vigilus Ablaze, the Black Legion as a faction are in a rather solid place. And here we have the Iron Warriors. Based on the faction focus, the Iron Warriors are supposed to be the strongest Chaos Space Marines army when it comes to ranged warfare. I love this sentiment. However, based on the trait as written, the Iron Warriors are only the strongest at ranged warfare if they are attacking a unit that is in cover. For the reasons I outlined when speaking about the Raven Guard, the -1 to hit outside of 12 inches has been put to great effect by Alpha Legion players, and effectively makes them the most dangerous at shooting, since it's a trait that is not only mechanically superior, but is also less situational. We can see similar to their loyalist rivals, the Imperial Fists, the Iron Warriors trait echoes a similar philosophy, but that is just a nice way of saying it's the exact same. And while I appreciate the idea of making the Iron Warriors the dark reflection of the Imperial Fists, these aren't the Fallen and the Dark Angels. They are 2 separate legions with their own unique history led by different Primarchs, and should not be identical. And since I've already covered the Imperial Fist trait, you can already understand the issues I have with the copy pasta here with regards to wounding buildings. To solve this problem, and provide the 4th Legion with an ability to actually make them feel like the strongest Chaos Space Marine army when it comes to ranged warfare, I would advocate that we change their trait to the following. Units with this ability can reroll 1 of the die used when it fires a weapon with a random number of shots, barring flame weapons, as long as they move half of their distance or less. If they remain stationary, they can reroll all of the dice used to determine the number of shots. Here we have a trait that justifiably offers value in exchange for movement. It speaks to their ability to siege like no other, but more importantly, it encourages Iron Warriors armies to take units and war gear that would be considered less reliable in the hands of other legions. And should this trait extend to vehicles and demon engines, it really blows the doors open for the Iron Warriors with regards to unit options, Suddenly, autocannon predators and vindicators and a host of Forge World siege armor units can now function more reliably and benefit from the Siege Lord's trait. Demon engines such as Forge Fiends can now output a more reliable volume to make up for their inferior ballistic skill, not to mention the combo potential with powerful stratagems like Demon Forge and force multipliers like the Master of Possession. Infantry can also benefit from the revised Siege Lord's trait with less meta choices such as missile launchers, which normally trade the perk of flexibility for a less reliable rate of fire. The suite of stratagems available in Codex Chaos Space Marines is actually quite strong, and I did want to advocate for a unique stratagem that would essentially allow the Iron Warriors to set up a trap for their opponents, an iron cage if you will. But the Devastation Battery, a specialist attachment that should arguably be for the Iron Warriors exclusively, offers a 1 CP stratagem, Punishing Volley, which effectively represents this quite well. And with these changes, it really feels like the Iron Warriors can be part of the conversation. Next up, the Night Lords. Looking at the faction focus, it's quite clear the Night Lords use fear as a weapon, turning it against their foes. With that in mind, let's take a look at the trait as it stands. I will be real honest, the Night Lords have, in my opinion, one of the best sub-faction traits in the game from a design perspective. It's incredibly unique while speaking to their fluff. The challenge of it requires a more cerebral style of play, and without a doubt requires a very high level of finesse. It demands that you apply layers of leadership debuffs across the battle, while still inflicting moderate casualties at those targeted points throughout your turn, and by its nature, demands that you make the right decisions to build up to a payoff in the morale phase. Or in simpler terms, the Night Lords are a higher difficulty playstyle, but with that challenge comes a more satisfying reward, which is incredibly meta with regards to the theme of it all. Looking at the trait as was framed when the Codex initially released, there was one major hurdle that further gated the sub-faction beyond its harder difficulty, that being, units arriving from Deep Strike needed to be placed 9 inches away. The area effect of the Terror Tactics aura is 6 inches, so they are required to make a charge, one which the math says it will fail most of the time. And there goes your carefully orchestrated plan. However, Vigilus Ablaze actually implemented a specialist attachment, the Host Raptorial, again which arguably should be Night Lords exclusive, which greatly helps solve the issue I outlined earlier, with regards to the Terror Tactics trait. First, you need to spend 1 CP on the specialist attachment, granting any jump pack units the Host Raptorial keyword. Then, you have to spend 1 more CP on the Field Commander stratagem to provide the HQ of that attachment with his own Warlord trait. That Warlord trait will allow Host Raptorial units within 6 inches to add 2 to their charge rolls. I cannot state enough the mathematical difference this makes, greatly increasing the odds of making a charge from Deep Strike, and solves the mathematical problem of using thematic jump pack units appearing from Deep Strike. If I'm honest, when you consider the level of difficulty of what Terror Tactics requires, I think it would be perfectly fair to say the Night Lords should have access to the Host Raptorial tools without needing to pay CP to unlock them. But what we have here is an official solution, which GW has implemented, that will allow the Night Lords to actually feel like Night Lords. Now I know I'm jumping ahead here, as I was tackling all of the Undivided Legions first, but I have some pretty radical points to make for the Word Bearers and Alpha Legion, so I thought best to save them for last. Let's take a look at the faction focus for this fan-favorite legion. To begin with, well, now I need to address this. While I understand they are being a little tongue-in-cheek with this statement, make no mistake that this is extremely disingenuous. It is because the World Eaters are a melee-focused army, they require a thorough understanding of the core mechanics, your enemy's units, and the mission objective. It requires you take all of that information and determine what will be the best course of action for 3 to 4 turns ahead. Recently, I started playing a mono Slaanesh Demons army, and doing so was somewhat revelatory. It has occurred to me that without a doubt, combat is the most powerful phase of the game you can engage in. That is to say, in the most perfect execution of a fight phase, your opponent will be put into an extremely difficult position, and will have to start their turn on the back foot. But the reality of it is it requires you to set up correct charges, survive enemy overwatch, make a 2d6 dice test to complete said charges, and carefully place your units to effectively pile in and consolidate and take advantage of area of effect abilities, and correctly choose the order of units to activate, and when to use critical stratagems. And all of this has to be done in a climate where a majority of units have guns that can just shoot you. My point is to choose a combat doctrine that focuses in melee can potentially yield devastating results. It is also an objectively harder route. With that in mind, let's take a look at the Legion trait for the World Eaters as it stands. Well, in keeping with the tone of the faction focus, the World Eaters have a very simplistic trait. I will say an extra attack is nothing to scoff at, but as time has gone on, it's lost its luster. Compare it to the newer traits for the combat-focused Loyalist chapters, looking specifically at the Blood Angels and the Space Wolves. Both of these sub-factions can take advantage of their perk, regardless of if they are the ones who charged or were charged. On top of this, the Blood Angels trait is far more impactful, and in the case of the Space Wolves, they are also granted an additional perk. So, to bring the Sons of Angron to the level of their contemporaries, I would advocate for the following. There is no change to the base of their trait, it's a rather elegant representation of the Butcher's Nails, but I would like to add that, in addition, World Eaters Infantry, Halberds, and Cavalry can add 1 to their move characteristic, so long as the model ends their move closer to the nearest enemy model. Look, rather than adding 1 to charge rolls, the World Eaters can better use that extra 1 inch of movement to help them get up the board. It's entirely possible a Chaos Rhino can meet its end on their opponent's terms, and gaining 1 inch of movement effectively equates to adding 1 to charge rolls anyways, as long as you aren't relying on Deep Strike. Plus, if we take into account what I mentioned in the primer about the Astartes' physicality already bringing their movement to 7, it means your infantry and halberds now move 8. How fluffy. Similar to the other Chaos Legions, the shared toolkit available in Codex Chaos Space Marines is actually rather strong. This has been bolstered, and with the release of the revised Dark Apostle, World Eaters' armies can now chant prayers, yielding useful buffs, the type of which were usually locked away to Psykers. However, a huge value add to all of the Chaos Legions we covered thus far has been that they weren't locked into a single Mark of Chaos, and in turn are benefiting from the expanded toolset and flexibility it provides. And in the World Eater's case, being locked into the Mark of Khorne adds yet another layer that makes things harder for the World Eaters players, which is why I'm advocating for 2 stratagems. The first being Skulls for the Skull Throne. I feel this is needed to lend the World Eaters a little more help. As a faction which specializes in melee and has 0 access to Psykers, and is locked to the Mark of Khorne, the World Eaters are fighting an uphill battle, and by my estimation require some additional resources to bring them in line with the other legions. A tool like this, while is effectively a way to gain back command points, the command points earned is not being obtained by the conventional refund mechanic, which is suggesting superior tactics. Rather, they are earned in brutal combat. And it pairs nicely with the Nails Bite Harder, allowing a character to gain an extra D3 attacks, which is mechanically similar to the Blood Angel stratagem, Red Rampage. On to the Thousand Sons. Similar to the Space Wolves and Blood Angels, I see 0 issue with the Thousand Sons toolkit. In fact, I think they have one of the highest ceilings among the Astartes factions as far as competitive performance goes in a single faction setting. Their Legion trait, Brotherhood of Sorcerers, adds 6 inches to all psychic powers manifested by Thousand Sun Psykers, and ignores the penalty of using repeated smites across their army. This not only means a longer range smite, but also means you have a further reach on spells that offer utility. It is a very fluffy and powerful ability for a legion whose unique selling point is being the best with psychic manipulations. Having their own codex, they have a range of unique units, access to 3 psychic disciplines, an above average suite of stratagems and relics, the best demon princes available to any codex, and powerful named characters such as Arman and their Primarch Magnus the Red. The Thousand Sons are just fine with regards to rule support. Next up, the Emperor's Children. I actually take no issue with the Emperor's Children. Aiming to be perfect in all regards, they seem to actually have the tools to do well in every area. Their trait Flawless Perfection allows them to maintain effectiveness against other melee-oriented forces, helping non-melee units mitigate incoming damage, and melee specialists potentially removing those threats altogether, and denying enemies the counter-offensive stratagem. If I am honest, I'm having a hard time finding issues with the Emperor's Children's toolkit. Being locked into the Mark of Slaanesh doesn't put them at the mechanical disadvantage the way it does for the World Eaters. They have access to Psykers, providing great offensive and defensive tools. Being forced to use the Mark of Slaanesh allows them to excel at shooting through the stratagem Endless Cacophony, allowing dangerous shooty units to shoot twice. and their trait paired with the stratagem Excess of Violence, which for 1 CP will allow an infantry unit to make an additional attack for each slain enemy model, will allow them to excel in the fight phase as well. And is further complemented by Debt to the False Emperor and the Icon of Excess. Overall, it's quite a solid toolkit, and it seems to me the reason they get passed on is because their best strengths are tied to being locked to the Mark of Slaanesh and not them specifically. Take a second and imagine if the Emperor's Children's stratagem, Excess of Violence, and the Mark of Slaanesh stratagem, Endless Cacophony, were swapped. All of a sudden, the Emperor's Children have a legitimate reason to be chosen over other legions, as they now have a valid mechanic that is uniquely theirs. However, I am just speaking in hypothetical terms. I am not an advocate of altering existing stratagems that are so interwoven with so many subfactions, but you can understand my point. Because of this, I feel the Emperor's Children should have an additional stratagem, something thematic akin to this. Limitless Sensation, for 1 CP. When you make your Craze test for your halberds, you can roll 1d6 for each wound lost instead of just 1. It's cheap for 1 CP, and it greatly improves the odds of the Emperor's Children's halberds getting crazy. In conclusion, I think the 3rd Legion, with the subtle inclusion added here, are quite valid, with some fun mechanics, and while they aren't the flashiest, their toolset allows them to be great generalists, or if they desire, they can excel in any area they choose. On to the Death Guard. My take? The Death Guard needs 0 help. Sure, there are a few oddities, as no subfaction is perfect, but considering that of the 4 initial codices released, Codex Death Guard has aged very well in comparison to the others. The reality that they are still viable in a competitive setting and offer multiple playstyles and builds is proof enough for me. Their Legion trait Inexorable Advance allows you to ignore the penalties associated with movement for assault and heavy weapons, which is nice, but it's their additional ability Disgustingly Resilient which serves as their unique selling point. Effectively nullifying 1/3 of all damage sustained is undeniably powerful in the hands of a veteran player, but it's a fantastic ability for newcomers as well, since it's very forgiving of mistakes. Well done GW, pairing the Death Guard against the Ultramarines in the Dark Imperium starter set for 8th edition. In any case, having their own codex, a unique range of units, having Disgustingly Resilient across a majority of their army, their own psychic discipline, a pretty nifty suite of stratagem and relics, along with a few named characters, and being led by their Primarch Mortarion, the Death Guard are doing quite well with regards to rule support. On to the Word Bearers. According to their faction focus, the unique selling point of the Word Bearers is their ability to combine powerful aura abilities with demonic allies. Before I get into the nitty-gritty, I would like to address the elephant in the room, that the Word Bearers have the worst subfaction trait amongst the Heretic Astartes, and I would even go so far as to say they have the worst overall toolkit even when compared to the newer Renegade chapters introduced in Vigilus Ablaze. And while I am all for those Renegades having fun, unique, and valid mechanics, there is no excuse as to why a first founding Legion has an offering as lackluster and downright mechanically poor as the Word Bearers. Their trait, Profane Zeal, allows you to reroll failed morale tests for your units. That's it. It's literally the basic rule all Loyalist Marines have. Look how special this first founding Legion is. My sarcasm aside, you could say, as bad as this trait may be, it will at some point save you from having some models flee. But let's call it what it is. This trait is not even within the conversation at all. You could choose a different subfaction that would make you more offensively potent, such as the Iron Warriors, who also have a Warlord trait to make all nearby units morale immune, or the Black Legion, who can access an auto-pass morale aura through Abaddon. Profane Zeal is just incredibly underwhelming for what should be the Legion, which should show how aligned the Traitor Legions have become with the Ruinous Powers, and it is definitely not a powerful aura ability as stated in the faction focus. In the interest of honesty, I actually had in mind for an out-of-the-box Acts of Faith-esque system that would have provided the Word Bearers with some thematic mechanics. However, with the release of the Master of Possession, the Malefic Discipline, Greater Possessed, and an updated Dark Apostle, the Word Bearers now have the tools to create some pretty fluffy lists that also have some pretty valid crunch as well. But all of that means nothing for what amounts to one of the worst sub-faction rules in the game. As I mentioned, the new options available to the Chaos Space Marines are very suitable to the Word Bearers, especially the new Dark Apostle, who is now able to chant prayers to the Chaos Gods. So I have advocated for a simple but complementary perk, that a Word Bearer's Dark Apostle roll 2 dice instead of 1 and pick the highest when attempting to chant prayers. It fits the new mechanics and speaks to the ideology behind Profane Zeal. And all of a sudden, the Word Bearers are offering something far more interesting, making their Dark Apostles outperform their contemporaries in the same manner a Thousand Sun Sorcerer would outperform other Legion Psychers, which is quite fitting. But there is one additional tool I would like to advocate for, a stratagem, one that is thematic, provides additional utility, and would be rather fun in my opinion. I am calling it Ritualistic Worship. For 1 CP, at the start of your turn, you can nominate a Word Bearer's Chaos Cultist unit for worship. That unit trades its ability to make activations for the rest of the turn, and if at the end of your turn, that unit is within 2 inches of a friendly Word Bearer's character, you gain 2 command points. If the worshipping unit is more than 20 models, you gain 3 command points, and if it's 30 men strong, it would award 4 command points. Being the Legion most attuned to the Pantheon, their followers are the most zealous and devout. To allow the Word Bearers to use their cultists as a sort of emotive battery to appeal to the Pantheon provides a fluffy and unique mechanic for the Word Bearers to generate CP, beyond just rolling dice to see if it gets refunded or gained. And lastly, we have the Alpha Legion. Looking at the unique selling points in the faction focus, we are told that they strike from several directions at once, as cultist, infiltrators, and vanguard units all strike in unison. With that in mind, let's look at their unique toolkit. Their stratagem is a 1 CP 9-inch movement used before the game begins, so you can use it as much as desired. It's good and speaks to the text in the faction focus. Their relic is a decent chainsword replacement. Their warlord trait is extremely thematic, allowing you to nominate a new character as your warlord if your warlord falls in battle. It allows you to make aggressive plays with your warlord, while denying your opponent the slay the warlord objective. The trade-off is that you must randomly determine the new warlord trait gained, which I think is more than okay. All things considered, I would say it's one of the best warlord traits in the game. Their trait makes them -1 to hit if they're more than 12 inches away, which, as discussed previously, is ludicrously powerful compared to some of the existing traits. As it stands, the Alpha Legion is mechanically the best subfaction by a large margin when based on the official rules. Their stratagem, relic, and warlord traits are all greater than or equal to an adequate level, but it's their trait that takes them over the top. That paired with being undivided, which allows them to make the most of all the chaos marks. It seems to me the Alpha Legion aren't best represented by being hard to hit. They don't make use of stealth tech like a Latok, or shadow slip like the Sons of Korax. They are essentially spies who use superior intelligence and subterfuge to execute plans, always being 1 step ahead. And I am willing to bet the only reason why they have a -1 to hit trait is because the Raven Guard do. It's quite clear that GW thought it would be a good idea to mirror several traits of the chapters in the Legions, and as we have seen with the Ultramarines and Black Legion, and Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors, I'm going to suggest we remove the -1 to hit trait for a rather radically different toolkit that, in my opinion, better speaks to the fluff and offers legitimate tactical flexibility. Alpha Legion units with this trait, other than units that can fly, can always claim the benefit of cover for the purpose of shooting attacks. If the unit advances or charges, it loses this benefit until the start of your next movement phase. This literally makes hidden in plain sight equivalent to prepared positions, which is a nice thematic coincidence. Speaking practically, it saves CP, which as you will see is useful, and this is where things begin to get rather out of the box. In addition, Chaos Cultists gain the Agents of the Hydra ability. At the end of each battle round, roll a d6 for each Chaos Cultist unit within your opponent's half of the board. On a 4+, you gain 1 CP. If the unit is in your opponent's deployment zone, you can add 2 to the rolled result. The reason for this out-of-the-box ability, only for Chaos Cultists, is as follows. Similar to the Word Bearers, Alpha Legion Chaos Cultists are a unique resource implemented with purpose, gathering valuable intel and providing utility for the Legion. And Chaos Cultists being the cheapest troops option for Chaos Space Marines does allow the creation of lists that are rich with command points. And a rule like Agents of the Hydra allows for Alpha Legion specifically to recoup an above average amount of command points. And since command points represent a strategic resource, it's rather suitable for a force like the Alpha Legion to be able to start with a plentiful amount and be able to maximize and adapt as needed, doing so with a mechanic that is more engaging than rolling dice to refund command points. Lastly, I have some stratagems which I think are rather integral for the Alpha Legion to properly complement the new paradigm. Infiltrate is essentially a common outflank style stratagem that you can see in other codices. Encrypted transmission for 1 CP, used in a game with tactical objectives to keep your objectives a secret from your opponent. And superior intel, for 2 CP, used at the beginning of the game but before the first turn, allowing you to redeploy an Alpha Legion character and a nearby Alpha Legion unit and set them up following the mission rules. Keeping in mind that their specialty is subterfuge preparedness and always being one step ahead, nothing is more emblematic of that than stratagems which give them tactical options before the game begins. These are the kinds of tricks Alpha Legion players should be able to utilize. The ability to use a wide array of stratagems before the game begins to set themselves up for success and adapt their tactics in subsequent turns. And while it will eat up several command points before the game begins, they have the means to regain some of those command points as the game continues. In summary, it will allow the Alpha Legion to play in the manner described, that being using insidious tactics and using units which suddenly appear to wreak havoc. They should be a more cerebral style army to play, considering their combat doctrines are literally about planning and being one step ahead, and not just be the strongest mechanically and also the easiest to play because they can be a -1 to hit gun line which capitalizes on the flexibility of all the chaos marks. And that brings this video to a close, and my goodness was it a long one. Thank you for watching. The style of content I like to create requires a ton of research and time to write, revise, record, and edit, so I hope you guys enjoyed the final result. And maybe you don't like my suggestions, which is okay, but I think you can agree that based on the breakdowns presented here, certain factions need to have their traits adjusted, and I know I can't be the only one with these frustrations. So, with that in mind, I would enjoy hearing your feedback on this topic as well, and your feedback on this video. Please keep in mind, for all my issues here, I really do like the vast majority of 40k 8th edition. I mean, how else could I make a video of this length? These are just problems which to me are glaring issues that run counter to the lore and also counter to good game mechanics, design, and balance, and could easily be corrected if given even a little attention. Anyways, in doing the research for this video, it has set up the groundwork for quite a few thematic list builds for many of the other legions. So that should give you guys some clue on what to expect. I'm going to try to step up my consistency, so here's hoping I see you guys next week. Thanks for watching.